Hey everyone, I'm Noor, she, her, and I'm a game designer at Riot Games. And despite being a Zoomer, as you just saw, I am very bad at navigating Zoom. So if my audio or video isn't coming through, please do let me know. With that out of the way, I want to invite you all to reflect on the last time you had a conversation with an NPC in your favorite role-playing game. For me, that's Paimon from Genshin Impact, and no, I'm not embarrassed about it. In traditional dialogue systems, your actions trigger predefined responses from the NPC, with more sophisticated systems adapting their responses based on prior interactions or choices within the conversation. Now, picture an NPC with access to your webcam. What could they infer from your posture, facial expression, or body language, just like real people can when holding a conversation? Taking it even further, imagine if the NPC could tap into your raw emotional data through physiological recordings. How would the conversation change if the NPC could tell how you felt better than real people can? As a game designer, I've had the huge fortune of working on a lot of old games throughout my career, including my current one, League of Legends. But coming from a background in neuroscience, I'm really curious about the future and how things will change as we better understand human cognition and behavior. Something I've noticed when thinking about the future of gaming is that we often focus on the technologies and platforms that enable play. Is it mobile or console, VR or AR? More realistic graphics, more ergonomic hardware, more advanced physics systems, more seamless crossplay. But we rarely center the locus of change on the player themselves and how they might engage with technology in different ways. I want to examine one possible direction for the future of play. We're in an era of computing in which mobile and wearable devices are heavily commercialized, and as a result, we have unprecedented access to real-time information about our bodies. At the same time, we're seeing early gamification of the physiological data collected by these devices, namely the Oura Ring and the Apple Watch, alongside a plethora of more niche wellness devices. And this is the question that motivated my talk. What does gaming look like as technology becomes more integrated with the human body? The field of human-computer integration offers an emergent paradigm for how we might approach this question. Traditional design frameworks will often think about the player and the gaming platform as separate entities. The platform outputs changes in the game state, and the player inputs decision. Human-computer integration challenges us to conceptualize the system as a single entity, an I/O device. And teasing the two halves apart a little bit, I'm going to first talk about the implications of the human body as an input device, through which peripheral devices unlock different sensory modalities. And then I'm going to talk about the human body as an output device, in which our physiological data can be used to create more adaptive games. So starting with the first half of this feedback loop, when we think about the human body as an input device in the context of gaming, we're typically referring to the game providing sensory feedback to the player. This is most commonly executed through visual and auditory feedback from a screen, but mobile devices, peripherals, and wearables have played an important role in rendering sensory feedback to the user's body. The most prevalent form of this feedback is haptics, first pioneered by the Rumble Pack in 1976 and Sega's line of racing games, which use vibrations to punctuate car collisions. And since then, haptic feedback has expanded in complexity and variety, from gyroscope interactions and spatialized haptics in mobile phones to the resistance of buttons and joysticks on console controllers. Despite the diversification of haptics, the types of sensory feedback afforded in video games has not evolved much since its inception. Specifically, games engage the same three modalities, vision, audition, and touch, and those types of feedback are localized to the eyes, ears, and hands while rarely engaging other parts of the body. But imagine what games could look like, for instance, if they explored vestibular feedback. The vestibular system is responsible for our body's sense of movement and acceleration in space. Even though tons of action games explore the feeling of movement, developers are limited to recreating those sensations through optic flow patterns or simulations of sound waves over distances. In other words, designers rely on vision and audition to approximate the sense of movement. This wearable device uses a technique called galvanic vestibular stimulation, or GVS, which electrically stimulates the vestibular nerve to create a feeling of acceleration without ever moving the user's body. Through different currents and voltages, the developers could recreate various forces and magnitudes of directions, like the drag of a race car or the drop of a roller coaster. And even though these developers have opted to create their own game experience, you can imagine playing Spider-Man or Ghost Runner with this device and being able to finally appreciate fuller-bodied parkour mechanics. Similarly, proprioception is the sense of body position in space, which is pivotal in our perception of collision, weight, and impact. While a very small number of games and platforms involve proprioceptive feedback, typically by requiring the player to move around, like the Wii U, it's typically omitted in traditional gaming experiences. This wearable device uses electrical muscle stimulation to move the user's body in response to in-game forces. For example, when hit with a projectile, their biceps flex as if impacted by an external force. Even micro interactions, like moving a dial, can animate the user's body, leading to a stronger sense of immersion, particularly for VR experiences that lack physical props. Moving out of somatosensation for a moment, chemosensation, which involves the sense of taste and smell, is another unexplored modality within games. Despite food and eating being incredibly important motifs, think Kirby, Yoshi, Pac-Man, Tom Kench, Cooking Mama, and even becoming a genre unto itself, somatosensory feedback is entirely absent in modern games. In this survival VR game created by yours truly, the player eats a single food prop, but tastes a variety of different foods. The key is an in-mouth wearable device, which dispenses chemical compounds called taste modulators to change the conformation of taste receptors on the tongue. These compounds allow for the up or down regulation of specific tastes. In this example, the blackberry that the player initially ate transforms into a sour lemon, then a sweet strawberry, and then a bitter spider, without ever changing the fruit itself. Imagine using this device to actualize the first meaningfully interactive virtual dining experiences. The purpose of reviewing those examples is to underscore that the sensory bandwidth of modern video games is relatively low, outside of vision, audition, and cutaneous somatosensation. Peripheral and wearable devices can close a lot of those gaps, allowing for more embodied virtual experiences. Transitioning to the second half of this feedback loop, framing the human body as an output device is a less conventional mode of thinking. Some concepts that come to mind may be social elements, like the player bringing their friends into the game, or controls in which the player provides commands that the platform reads. But in actuality, players output tons of signals in response to games. For example, pupil dilation can indicate cognitive load, certain brain signals can be associated with the perceptions of novelty, and facial expressions can help categorize emotions. When we can measure a player's internal states, what types of gameplay can we create? First, looking at how these signals can be applied to mechanics, the game I'll reference is called Nevermind, which is a first-person horror game developed by the indie studio Flying Mollusk. Nevermind is split into a series of rooms that the player has to navigate in order to solve puzzles. The game records the player's facial expression and pulse to determine what they're feeling and how intense that feeling is, respectively. The difficulty of the puzzles in each room scales based on the player's emotion. In this example, the player's stuck in a room that's flooding, and if the player is really scared, the room will flood faster. So they have to intentionally stay calm in order to escape. In other words, interpreting signals from the human body can create personalized and responsive mechanics that operate on a moment-to-moment basis. Thinking about input schemes, I'll start with this video of myself because I'm really vain. In this video, I'm using a device called an EEG, which stands for electroencephalogram, to read electrical activity from my brain and use it to control a character in 2D space using only my thoughts. What's really exciting to me isn't that I think this is a good control scheme on its own, because I don't think that. It's thinking about this in the context of accessibility. Through my previous research in neuroscience, I met Scott, who was injured in a car accident in the 1980s, which eliminated his sense of touch and left him paralyzed from the neck down. He has sets of electrodes implanted in the brain regions responsible for movement and touch. And even though he can't move his real body very well, he can think about moving. And we can use those thoughts to control a virtual limb in a really simple VR game. Effectively, Scott doesn't have robust motor control in the real world, but we can use implanted devices to restore those functions in a virtual world. Taking a step back from these examples, the integration of physiological recordings through gameplay through peripheral devices opens up new possibility in game design. By capturing these signals, games can become more personalized, responsive, and adaptive to the emotional and cognitive states of our players. In sum, the field of human-computer integration reimagines the intersection of the human body and gaming platforms as an I/O device, giving way to more embodied, sensorized, and adaptive virtual worlds. When we think about innovation in games through the lens of the technologies that enable play, we limit ourselves to familiar modes of engagement. We think about controllers, screens, and hardware systems. But if we shift our perspective to reanimate the player's relationship to these technologies, we begin to see the potential to actuate and interpret the human body in novel ways. But more importantly, human-computer integration challenges us to be speculative about the future of play. I always say that it's hugely convenient that the electricity that runs through your body and the electricity that powers the video games we play are fundamentally the same thing. And I encourage designers to think about what happens when we connect the two. That's what I got. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Noor. That was fantastic. We do have some time for questions. So I saw someone raising their hands. So you can ask your question live, or let's see if there's something in your Q&A. There's a question from Albert. Noor, how do you have access to all these prototype input technology for research?
I'm very grateful to have a lot of grants that help me do that. So my previous grant was with the Department of Defense, which is very generous in providing me with a lot of these hardwares. For some of the prototyping devices, they were either handmade by me 3D printing a lot of devices and hoping for the best, or someone a little bit more technical in my lab would help me with, for example, some of the more like woodworking or soldering prototype devices. So it's some combination of scrapping it together or getting a lot of funding to purchase them.
That's fantastic. Are there any other questions since we have 5 more minutes? Look at this. Woo! So if you have any questions, feel free, and now's the time. It's weird because I see the hand coming up and then it goes back down immediately. So you can raise your hand and then I can unmute you. You can ask your question live, or you can ask your question in the Q&A. What are you the most excited about in the future, Noor, as we're waiting for more questions?
I think accessibility is a really exciting opportunity space for me. For me, when I think about accessibility, it's not just thinking about disabled populations, it's thinking about better understanding who our players are. I think we've had a really long held assumption as an industry that our players are like able-bodied, male, and from like particular gaming cultures in regions in Asia or the West. But in actuality, our players are really diverse, and players are getting younger and older, and 44% of them identify as women.
Yeah.
So when we think about like expanding who our audience is, I think accessibility is a really important first step
Yeah,
and having a broader conversation about reevaluating what we think about when we say a gamer.
absolutely. There's a question from Nat. Nat?
Hey, Nat. Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
So my question is kind of like, where do you see the convergence in technology that allows all of these things to be sort of more affordable? Like a lot of the accessibility devices these days cost hundreds of dollars, and even like the DualSense controller, it has, I think, around 2 to 4 motors in there, and like to get more fidelity into those controllers, you could add like 16 motors to get like multi-dimensional vibration, cancellation, all of these different features. But then you're looking at probably like a $400 controller.
Yeah, totally. That's a super, super great question. There's kind of two ways I'll slice it. One is that um, a lot of fidelity that we get out of peripheral devices can be variable, but still explore different modalities. You were mentioning haptics being a really great example where we can have these super high fidelity and embedded experiences that have lots of different motors that can output like different currents and waveforms. But we can also have devices that are a little bit more limited in their capacities, but still effective in their use of them. I think the iPhone is a really great example of like a highly advanced haptic system that has gyroscopes and also a variety of different vibrotactile sensations. And obviously the iPhone is expensive, but it's embedded in a device that you already have access to and probably didn't buy specifically to play video games. I think another field that adopts that philosophy really well is thinking about brain recording devices, where you can opt for, the $100 million device that I showed with Scott, where he has neural implants embedded into his brain, or you can opt for something that I use on myself, which is an external peripheral device to record certain patterns of brain activity. So there's kind of a sliding scale model that we can adopt. I think also I'm really optimistic about form factors getting smaller means price goes down. As we get a little bit more sophisticated at designing devices that are like increasingly small form, getting into like the motors in your phone itself, um, price and cost just seems to like follow that form factor. So as we developed more advanced systems around like mobile computing and wearable computing specifically, I'm optimistic that will kind of naturally become a little bit more affordable and accessible.